Well, welcome to the Bridges of Meaning Discord Q&A. I'm Catherine Wilson, the host conversation today, and I'm joined by Jonathan Pageau.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome here. We're so pleased that you joined us this week, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's great. I'm happy to finally be doing this. It's one of the I kind of drop in the Bridges of Meaning Discord once in a while just to kind of see what's going on. And I've done some weird things because I'm so not literate on Discord that I've kind of I clicked on things and then ended up in like video conversations and people being like, "Hey, what is Jonathan doing here?" So some of you, Andrea has seen me like pop into these conversations. So I'm a little aware of what's going on, but not super aware of the Bridges of Meaning discussions.
Well, we've got a pile of questions for you, so hopefully you brought a glass of water or a beer because we're going to jump in.
It's a little early for beer, in my opinion, but I do have a glass of water.
All right, Matthias asks, will you give more talks in Europe in the upcoming future?
I don't know. Everything is so confused since COVID. It's hard to even this event that I'm doing in Denmark. I keep thinking it's not going to happen. Even though everything is set up and the tickets are bought and everything. So I have no idea. I'd be happy to do more talks in Europe, but it still seems very iffy in terms of travel. So.
Mm-hmm. All right. Nate Hill asks, Nicholas Berdyaev wrote, the distinction between the things of Caesar and the things of God is constantly being erased in our fallen world. And this always indicates that the kingdom of Caesar is attempting to swallow up the kingdom of God. Sergei Bolkahov has expressed a similar idea in even stronger language. The state bears the likeness of the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit, and as such it blasphemes all that is holy. Between it and the church there can be no peace, for the beast of the state the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth. 2 Thessalonians 2:5. It will be overthrown and annihilated in the kingdom of the saints. Though this itself be but a temporary and, as it were, symbolic triumph of the church on earth. But it is in conflict with the beast that the church appears in its true colors as a community united in the basis of love, not by any kind of constraint, which for the state, on the other hand, is only natural. Accordingly, any concordant between the church and state can only be a compromise, necessarily embarrassing to the church, which must always remain in relation to the state, an anarchic force. The question I have is this: do you not fear that the way you talk about the hierarchy in the singular underplays this opposition between the rival kingdoms in such a way that it aids the effort of the kingdom of Caesar, precisely in its blurring of that distinction?
I understand the worry of the question. I understand what you mean, and I think that if you follow what I've been talking about carefully, you'll notice that I am trying to actually expose the ambiguity which needs to be present in Scripture and present in the tradition. And the problem that you arise, I don't think it just goes one way. And I think that to try to simply oppose one to the other is not accurate in terms of how it represents itself in Scripture and in the tradition. One of the things I've been talking about is the ambiguity, for example, of the symbolism of Alexander the Great, even in Byzantine tradition, with the apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, and this kind of ambiguity between, let's say, the Holy Emperor and the Antichrist figure, and or Rome as the beast, and the beast and the prostitute, and then Rome as an image of the New Jerusalem. And so I think that we can't completely disentangle those two realities, because you can't get out of the fact that the image of the New Jerusalem, if you look at it in Revelation, it is the finality of the tradition of Cain. It is the end of that tradition, of the scandalous tradition of civilization. Nonetheless, ends with this dual image, one of the beasts coming out of the sea and one of the city coming down from heaven. And so that's it. That's the problem that we're trying to deal with. And you can understand it as a conflict which is ever present in the moment, where authority, on the one hand, like St. Paul says, is is given from God, and we need to respect the authority that is given to us. But on the other hand, that authority is constantly in danger of becoming idolatrous and self-sufficient and thinking that it is God and not giving up to God. So one of the images we see in Revelation is that in the New Jerusalem, it says the glory of all the nations will be gathered into the New Jerusalem. And so that is so that image is that it is possible for the worldly things to become a vehicle for the grace of God. We need to believe that. We need to believe that because that's what we believe the transformation that Christ brings about can manifest. But that isn't completely revealed, let's say, in the world, and there's still this battle between those two, between those two sides. And so I understand where sometimes when you watch my video and I talk about hierarchy, and I don't all the time explicitly differentiate, let's say, the holy hierarchy and the natural hierarchy or the hierarchies of the world. I can understand how that can maybe people think that I somehow agree with abuses of power on the side of states, but I definitely do not, and I definitely fear. And if you follow my work more, you'll realize that I'm very much afraid of the tyrannical aspect of civilization and this line of Cain manifesting itself as a Tower of Babel and as all of these images of and the beast in Revelation, all these images of tyranny is something that I'm very much worried about. And I see the kingdom of heaven as rather a balance between a proper hierarchy where those above, their role is to give to those below and to care for those below, and those below are there to kind of submit to that which is above. And there are moments in history, and there are moments in the Rome, in the empire, where that has happened more or less, never 100%. But there are moments where that balance was closer to what it could be. And so I also I don't believe that the church is an anarchic force. That I think doesn't play out in the things that Christ says, and it doesn't play out in the things that St. Paul says. And it doesn't play out the way that Christians acted in the first centuries as they were being persecuted. Even though they were being persecuted, they never tried to dismantle the authority of the state. They never tried to break down the power of Rome. They were faithful citizens up to the point of those things where the Roman Empire asked them to do things which were immoral. And so that's the way that I see it. But I can understand your how you can see some danger in what I'm saying, and I think that your call to me being attentive to that is not is I take it seriously, and I think sometimes we need to be maybe more careful so that people don't confuse this pattern that I'm talking about with just this top-down tyrannical power of the state, let's say. So thanks for your question.
Nate, are you here? Did you want to add anything to that? Yeah, he's here.
No, that was a very fair response. I mean, I still have my reservations about the identification of Jerusalem. That's also Oliver O'Donovan's argument. Not sure I entirely agree with that, but that clarified a lot to me, like where you're coming from. And I've seen like a lot of that. I've like followed Jonathan's work fairly closely, so I was aware of that that he was trying to walk that line, and I appreciate the thoughtful response.
All right. So, next question from Grizz Grimm. Well, the apostle of purpose himself. What is the symbolism of the Wachowski siblings' public narrative, i.e., extremely successful filmmakers transitioning gender? Does their sacrifice give symbolic power to their films?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by sacrifice. I think that if you pay attention to the Matrix movies, you can see that the narrative of transgenderism is already there in the movie, which is the idea that there can be a complete and absolute disjunct with the way you manifest in the system and the way that you exist in reality. And I think that this played itself out in their own narrative. And so I've heard one of I forget which Wachowski, I forget their name, which one is which, but I I heard one of them recently speaking about the relationship between their transitioning and the Matrix, and talking about this idea of freedom and the idea of creativity, that you create yourself, and that they have embarked on a let's say path where they are creating themselves, and they're not, you could say something like, they're not bound to the authority of the world telling them who they are. And so I think that it makes total sense in their vision of the Matrix and their own story that they would end up where they are. I think that their story isn't over. They're probably will transition into something else at some point.
Nej, sorry.
There's some sound coming from somewhere. I don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah. Let's see. Was that you, Gris? Were you going to add something?
I think he doesn't know his mic is on, maybe.
Maybe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, very good. It does seem like they are unavoidably intertwined, the films and then their life and the whole philosophy. So
Yeah.
All right. Deep Dark Seas John asks, some of us current and former charismatics on Bridges of Meaning have discussed a model for understanding the charismatic movement. In this scheme, charismaticism is the fire and the traditional hierarchical church is the fireplace. In the symbolic language, fire might correspond to confusing but renewing time, that is, speaking in tongues, miraculous healings, and ecstatic worship. Likewise, a fireplace implies stable but inflexible space, that is, established tradition and church hierarchy and authority. Do you think there is a place for charismatic movements to renew and recreate an overly rigid church when it loses connection to spiritual meaning? Likewise, is the church a fireplace to contain and channel the chaos and excesses of the charismatic movement toward a higher spiritual purpose?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I'm not one of those people who thinks that the charismatic experience is either a delusion or B, satanic, or or that kind of stuff. Like, I don't necessarily think that that's what's going on. But I also find it difficult because so you can see that in the Orthodox tradition, for example, spiritual experience is extremely downplayed. It is extremely suspicious. And the thing about that is that it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It happens all the time. People have spiritual experiences all the time in Orthodox tradition. But there is a sense in which that's not the point. And so the point is to be transformed as a person into the image of God. And so it implies that experiences, but those experiences need to take you up the hierarchy. And you need to not grab onto those experiences because they can delude you in thinking that whatever experience you're having, like, that's it. This is what it's about, because it can be so intoxicating that it can have its own value to you. It can have its own motivation. And so, I don't know enough about the state of the charismatic tradition where it is. But the people that I've known that have been in the charismatic movement, I felt like they had a desire to see miracles and to have experiences and to speak in tongues and to do all these things. And like I said, it's not that those things are wrong in themselves, is that they're really not the purpose of the spiritual life, or they're not what we're meant to aim for. And so I agree that these kind of, let's say, more ecstatic states, or these, how can I say this kind of the possibility of changing states of consciousness, or of having these types of events, they can maybe be like a little clincher for people to transform themselves. But that's what the goal has to be. And so that's maybe my best answer to that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thaumaton says, hello, Jonathan. I saw a video of yours where you started to talk about God's energies, but then said that the term has too much modern baggage and dropped the subject. It's been a while, but I believe the context had to do with the way in which God exerts authority over phenomena. Could you expand on this subject? Thank you.
Well, yeah, the notion of God's energies in the Orthodox tradition is, you could say that see it as God's actions or God's involvement in reality. And the idea in kind of Orthodox metaphysics is that God is actually underlying all phenomena. So it's not just about authority over phenomena, but it's kind of the indwelling of God in phenomena, and the hidden wills of God that can be discovered hiding in the world. So the world is sustained by God's energies, and which means that the world itself has the possibility of being transfigured all the time for those that are capable of seeing it. It's like the world is secretly transfigured all the time for those who are attuned to God and can kind of see his energies or participate in his energies. And so you'll have these description of mystics who see the uncreated light. And that's the idea, is that they suddenly see that the world is full of God, and that God is that which holds the being of the world together. And so that's what I mean by the divine energies. And so the idea in mystical practice is that through a kind of participation, or through a kind of let's say through a kind of participation in God's energies, then that is actually how you are transformed into God, and that's how you become God, by doing that. By, let's say, you can understand it as like a God kind of this, like say the thin thread of divinity descends into all of reality, and you have the capacity of being touched by that. And if you continually are touched by that, then it's like it's not that you can save yourself, but it's almost like you can kind of grab onto the thread. And then as you grab onto the thread, that thread becomes more real to you, and then you grab onto it more, and then it becomes more real, and then you grab onto it more. So there's this process of, let's say, grace and participation on your part, which is a cycle that brings you into the life of God. So that's the way to understand the idea of the divine energies. But it's also a metaphysical proposition about how the world exists, and how it's possible for things to exist in the notion that there's nothing outside God, but we're also not God. Like the world is not God, but the world is in God, and God is in the world. That's probably the best way to explain it.
So, like on a practical level, does that, like, if God's energies are in everything, let's say the flower or the lake or whatever, practically, does that mean just shifting your attention towards it and attending to those aspects that are beautiful and transcendent?
Well, you could say it more like, if you attend to God, right, then what's going to happen is the world is going to start to shine, and you're going to see the hidden purposes of things. And those purposes of things, they are, you could say something like, they are the will of God in that thing. They are the energies of God hiding in the phenomena. So it's mostly about attending to God, and attending to God, and being cautious, and attending to your sins, like being aware of your sinfulness, and then the world starts to kind of shine. That's at least the way that I understand it. And the little moments that I've had, these little glimpses of those moments that we sometimes have, I've had let's say, a taste of that, but it's obviously not as much as is possible. And in the Orthodox tradition, there really is a way of being, like there's a prayer, this idea of repeating a prayer, and being mindful of your thoughts, holding your thoughts captive, holding your passions captive, practicing certain types of asceticism is also a way to kind of cleanse your nous, right? So the idea is that you have a faculty to perceive God directly, but that faculty is covered by garments of skin. And so if you cleanse this capacity, then you start to see God shining in the world.
So, as a Protestant, when I hear you say attending to your sin and repenting, I'm probably hearing that in a different way than you mean as an Orthodox.
Well, probably, because in the Orthodox tradition, you're sinning all the time. You're sinning constantly. You're nonstop sinning, right? We ask forgiveness for the sins that we do consciously and unconsciously, unwillingly. It's the idea of just missing the mark. You're missing the mark all the time. Even you could say something like even not perceiving the will of God in things is already a kind of sin, in the sense that you're missing the mark. It's not a moral thing, but it's just a missing of what reality is for, and a missing of what your life is for. And so we're sinning all the time.
Well, I would agree with that.
Okay.
No, that's
Hey,
helpful.
Jonathan.
That's helpful.
Jonathan, if I may, something that I've been trying to talk to Paul about for a really long time is panentheism, and he doesn't really like to give it the time of day, but basically what you were just articulating to me sounds like panentheism. And I think, from my understanding, is that's just kind of basic Orthodox theology. And I think it's hard for Protestants to wrap their head around, because they live in this post-Augustinian kind of understanding of man, where man is completely divorced from God. And so could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, I think there are some Orthodox theologians. I think Philip Sherrard, for example, argued even explicitly for that term, to use the word sorry, panentheism. And so sorry. And so, yeah, I mean, it's fine. If it's well understood, it's fine. I think it's not. Sometimes it's misunderstood but I think if it's well understood, that's fine in terms of the world. That is that all things are in God, and that God is in all things. And I mean, that's just St. Paul. Like, it's not a. Depending on how you understand it, obviously, I don't see how anybody who's Christian could object to that. But I think people are worried about idolatry, and that's probably the reason why people struggle with that way of seeing things. And so the best way to understand that is that things, like, it's also about how there's a kind of emptying. There has to be a kind of emptying so that you see God in things. So it doesn't happen through pride, but it happens actually through humility and through emptying. And that's when the surprise is that as you empty your attachment to things, as you empty your desire for things, then all of a sudden they start to glow. And so it's kind of like the opposite of idolatry, which is, it's not like saying I'm going to be attached to this thing in itself because it is full of divinity, because God is in it, but rather I'm going to detach myself from in terms of passion, and then that detachment will then show us how God is present. So maybe that's a way to deal with it, that can help the difficulty people have with understanding the world that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. It reminds me of what you were just saying. Reminds me of one of my favorite Master Eckhart quotes, which is, "Salvation, or finding God, is not found by addition, but by a process of subtraction." And even with the recent Vervaeke conversations, they were talking about kenosis, and I thought a good little aphorism would be kenosis by kenosis.
Sounds good.
All right. Aaron asked the next question. Did you know that there is a German Orthodox monastery in Germany? The abbot started it around 1990 with the blessing of his spiritual father from Mount Athos. They are translating and celebrating liturgy in the German language. What is the role of Germany in universal history?
I mean, the German. I think that they're all the kind of northern people. Let's say they all seem to have a function in terms of universal history. I even talked about this yesterday in the Q&A. There's an image of this idea of the invaders of the north, right, which come down. You see that even in scripture. This idea of these invaders that come down from the north, and it seems to have something to do with a kind of out of control wind. This out of control wind that comes down and burns everything, or like a fire that descends and then burns things. And so that seems to be what the Germans and the Scandinavians were, not just them, but the Huns and the Mongols, all these nations that came down from the high places to kind of devour the world, let's say. And then what happens is that if those types of influences can find a body, then they become very powerful because they have all that energy from the north, let's say, all that northern energy, or that energy that descends. And if they can transform that, then they can create very powerful bodies. And so an example of that, of course, is to see how the Middle Ages is basically about that. The Middle Ages is about the northern people converting. That's what the Middle Ages are about. That's what, all the kingdoms, the kings of Britain, the kings of the nobles of Normandy, and how the Norman nobles basically, decided what was going on in France, and then the Sicilian kings, but then not just in the West, but also in the East, because the Rus were the Scandinavians joining with the Slavs. The Russian aristocracy was Scandinavian, and you see the same, like even in the last moments of the Byzantine Empire were guaranteed by Scandinavians, because around the emperor was the Varangian Guard, which were Scandinavians that had been given to the emperor from the Prince of Kiev, or different principalities in the northern lands, and they were basically the ones who were holding the fort, like holding Islam out of the gates of Constantinople. And so and even a huge, this is something that people don't know about, but there was when William the Conqueror took over Britain, the nobles that were there before, some of them, they went to Constantinople and joined. They became a part of this kind of military might of Constantinople, even at that time. So people don't know about that, but it's very interesting. So that's the way. That's how to understand that the part that the northern people can play in universal history. But it's like that's why you should be very afraid when the northern people stop being Christian, because it's like that fire can start to burn again. And we saw a little bit of more than a hint of that in the 20th century, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that was interesting. Thank you. I didn't know that. All right, Albert. He asks, I've heard you talk about asceticism before. While it makes sense to me, it also raised a question in my mind. If the denial of all earthly is the best way to become closer to God, then why shouldn't every Christian be expected to take up that cross? Are those of us with families which require a certain amount of worldly focus doomed to be forever lower on the mountain of paradise than those who are able to give up all such concerns to spend their days meditating and praying? If so, do we have a duty to encourage our children to take a different path than the one that produced them?
So the answer is mostly yes, in the sense that you probably are lower on the spiritual hierarchy of being because of your attachment to worldly things. But it's you have to see it as a hierarchy. That's the way to see it, and it's not an exclusionary hierarchy; it's a participative hierarchy. And so you have to understand that, to a certain extent, the monks who sacrifice their productivity in the world, they sacrifice their generation, they sacrifice, the fact that they'll continue their self-sacrifice in that sense, actually is actually the core, the heart, which makes good those of us that do engage in that. It's that's maybe hard for people to kind of understand. It's like the world is based on sacrifice, and the sacrifice is what holds the positive aspect of the world together. And so the idea that there are monks that are praying, 24 hours a day, that is what participates in the good of you being a good father and having children and raising them in Christ and, teaching them to pray. And that is what is actually holding that together. But you also have an ascetic quality to what you're doing, which is that, you know, being married, having children is already an ascetic practice, because, you know, you could be going around sleeping with prostitutes, and like there are all kinds of things you could be doing that wouldn't be this ascetic process. So you have to see it like as that's like a hierarchy of asceticism, and the higher you go on that hierarchy of asceticism, the more you sacrifice the world, but doing that actually makes the world alive at the lower rungs of the hierarchy. So I don't know if that makes sense. It's hard. It's kind of hard to see the world that way. But if once you understand the mystery of the cross and the mystery of sacrifice, it almost becomes inevitable. But I mean, should you encourage your children to take a different? Maybe let me answer that one. It's like, I think most parents don't want their kids to be monks. And I think that most parents, if their kids were monks, they would be kind of, they'd be like, oh man. And I think that's part of it too. It's like, I think that's a completely normal reaction, that you don't want your kids to be monks, but that's also part of, you also don't want your kids to be martyrs. It's like, I don't want my kid to be a martyr. And I know that being a martyr is to the glory of God, and that being a martyr participates in making the church exist, but I don't want that for my kids. So I think that's also part of this that's part of being where you are in this kind of hierarchy of being, let's say.
Did you want to add anything, Albert? All right. I think there has to be a way, though, Jonathan, where I can get everything and be at the top.
That's right.
I'd like the honor and all of my pleasures and comfort now. I'd like.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Huh? Can't we just have everything? You know. Yeah, the road that Christ lays in front of us is really just not. It's like you can see that that's right. You can see that it's right. You can see that that's how the world works, but it's not yeah, there's a reason why, you know, it's thin. That's a reason why it's a thin line, you know, that it's a narrow road. So
okay. T.S. Apostolos, hope I'm saying that right. René Girard said in an interview, Christianity will be victorious, but only in defeat. Christianity is the same scheme as archaic religions. It is an instance of scapegoating, but, and this difference is enormous, instead of blaming the victim and joining the scapegoaters, it realizes that the victim is innocent, and we all try to interpret this type of situation in the light of the innocent victim, that is Christ himself. In a world that is no longer organized along the rigid lines of scapegoating and the sacrifices that reenact it in the penal systems, we have more and more disorder. More and more freedom, but more and more disorder. Does Christianity have to be defeated and in the natural symbolic order rise victorious? Where do you see us in this process?
I mean, I think that if you've been paying attention to what I've been saying recently, that's what I'm saying. I try not to scream it up on the rooftops because there's something about it which is scandalous, I guess. But it's like I think that's exactly what's happening. I think that Christianity will die. You know, maybe not in the sense that it'll completely disappear for the world, but I think for all intents and purposes, Christianity has to die. And you can see it like these, let's say you can see it like a fractal pattern that is getting bigger. And you can understand that Christ died and then transformed the world in a hidden form, let's say, that started to have fruits. And then the martyrs died and they transformed Rome by their death. And now it's playing out even at a bigger scale. And it's actually going to be part of the emptying. You could understand it like as an emptying of Christianity. And you can see it like let's say as Europe and as Western culture, as Rome, let's say, evacuates Christianity, it's moving out into all these other nations, you know. And so that's kind of the hilarious situation, which is that there very soon will be probably already more Christians in Africa or in Asia than there will be in Europe and in North America, or in the Middle East. And so as we kind of see this dying of Christianity, it also fills the world up at the same time. And I think that process has to be consummated. So I'm not saying that it's good. Like, it's not good. Like, the people that killed Christ are not good. The death of Christ is not a good in the sense, it's a good in the sense of what it ultimately will lead to, but we can't celebrate, the Roman soldiers that nailed Christ to the cross, right? And so, and we can't celebrate Peter denying Christ, even though we understand that the denial of Peter had to do with his transformation and then becoming the stone on which Christ, the shepherd that Christ gave the flock to. And so all of this is happening at bigger scales. And I think that we will see, and we're already seeing, a denial of Peter, but we also have to understand it as that's part of the story. And we have to trust and be faithful in that moment, and just continue on knowing that, there's a resurrection on the other side of this. So that's really, I mean, I think maybe it's funny because I maybe have never made it as explicit as I have now in terms of what I think the story is going to look like, which is why, like, if you see the way that I talk about how to be in the world, I'm not, on the one hand, I can decry the tyranny of the state and the tyranny of this kind of woke cancel culture and how it's anti-Christian and how it's kind of swallowing up Christianity and destroying it. I also am not posing political gestures like in any way. And I don't think that that's our role to do that. And I know some people will disagree with me, and that's fine. But at least in my own story, I've decided not to act in that way. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a new element for me, because when I've heard you talk about it before, it's been more from the element of time. So saying, like, we've come to this cycle in time. But the way you just explained it, it sounded more to me like space. Like, if you look at the map laid out, it's sort of this explosion going out where there's Christianity that goes and then dies in its own wake as it fills out the outer edges of the hierarchy. So
yeah, that's how I see it happen, and that's how I see it happen even historically, you could say. So yeah.
We had a question piggybacking on the last one, having to do with asceticism and martyrdom. And people were wondering if you could comment on the connection between marriage and martyrdom.
Well, marriage is a form of sacrifice. It's a form of cross. Like, you hear that all the time. Orthodox priests always say marriage is a cross. And why is it a cross? It's because it's a relative denial of desire, right? It's a relative focusing of desire, and it's trying to constrain your desire into one place. And then even within marriage, there's a sense, at least in Orthodox tradition, that you're supposed to move towards asceticism. And this is a hard one for modern people to think. And it's a hard one for me. Like, I'm not saying that I'm on this path, but the idea is that even within your marriage, you're supposed to move towards what would ultimately be almost like a monastic reality in your marriage. Like, that where you are, that the sexual element of marriage kind of diminishes as time moves on, and a more spiritual bond becomes the union between the man and the woman, and the man and the wife, especially after the man and the woman have had children and have raised their family. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm not saying that it's immoral not to do that. It's completely moral to continue to have a sexual relationship with between spouses. It's more that in the idea of asceticism, like in the idea that marriage is already a form of asceticism, then we can understand that, at least in the Christian mind, that's where it can lead to, and it's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing. It's a preparing to die. It's a moving away from the passions as you move closer to the end of your life. So that's the relationship between, let's say, marriage and martyrdom.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Jotham asks, hello, Jonathan. I hope that you're doing well. I have a couple of questions. Feel free to answer or not. One, is there / what is the symbolism of sport? 2, could you elaborate on the history of icon carving? Can you tell which period icons are from just based on how they look? And 3, what hair product do you use? Many thanks
What
and
hair
God bless.
products do you use? That's hilarious. Well, the symbolism of sport is I talked about it yesterday. Actually, sorry, my dryer just stopped. I talked about it yesterday in my Q&A. It has to do with the kind of the symbolism of conflict, and so it does participate in symbolism. It's basically an army, two armies fighting each other, and one vanquishing the foe. And so, to the extent that that type of symbolism is useful, you can find it in Scripture. You can find it, even in the New Testament. Like to the extent that that symbolism is fruitful, then it's fine, but it's limited because ultimately it's about duality, and this duality between two sides. And so it like I said, it can be useful because as you are playing a game, a sport, it's usually a little microcosm of reality, which is, let's say, you're playing basketball, then you have to be able to master this thing. You have to master this little round thing, and you have to aim it towards a basket, or you have to aim it towards something. And so it can help you understand what sin is when you miss. It can help you understand what attention is when you're playing, and when you have to be completely focused on attention. And you can understand also that attention is not thinking. Thinking and attention are not the same. Because if you think too much when you're playing a game, then you're in trouble. Like it's just not, that's not how it works. And it can also understand, kind of what John Vervaeke talks about when he talks about flow, this idea of entering into a space where you seem to be in complete communion with what you're doing, and that it makes you almost kind of transcend your own possibilities and transcend time, even, when you become almost like unconscious or hyper conscious at the same time. It's hard to explain. Everybody has probably had those types of experiences when you're doing something you're very good at, and then all of a sudden it's as if everything kind of comes together and you're totally one with what's going on. And so sport can also help you do that. And so I think it's useful to the extent that it's useful, let's say. Okay, so let's elaborate on the history of icon carving. I mean, that's a big question. When I give my icon training classes, I have like a 1.5 hour lecture that I give on the history of icon carving. But, it's there from the beginning. And yes, I can't usually tell where and when an icon comes from, depending on what it looks like. And an interesting little tidbit about icon carving is that in the later periods, let's say from the 17th century onward, there was an active hostility in Orthodoxy towards carving. And it had strangely to do with a fear of westernizing influence, but also westernizing influence at the same time. It's as if the influence of the West made some people doubt carving because they thought it was too Western. And then some people hate Orthodox carving because they wanted something more Western. And so there's a strange moment in Russia where carving was banned by Peter the First. And not only banned, but like carvings were ripped out of churches and burned in these piles of carvings. They even found like some carvings, half burnt carvings, that someone kind of pulled out of the fire and like hid in like the rafters of a church to try to save them. And so it's an interesting story, but I would say that it's been completely reincorporated now and has been restored to its former participation in the church. But if it could help you understand something about me, it's also a secondary art in the Orthodox tradition. It's like a marginal art. It's not the central way to represent the saints. It's kind of a secondary one. So. What hair products do I use? Sorry, I don't use any hair products. I don't pay much attention to my. That's why I'm always never shaving. And so I just wash my hair and that's it. And then I don't think about it. That's how I do it. So
spoiled.
I don't know what to
spoiled. All right. Dan asks, concerning technology, it seems that technology isn't viewed too positively in the city Cain founded, or the drunken Noah, or the spirits in the book of Enoch that taught mankind technology. How exactly does technology square with Christianity? What is the proper human in this regard? Who are the saints? What does it mean that the New Jerusalem is a city? Why can't you just reject technology as such? Is it problematic to help people in an abstract way with technology without a personal relationship with them or even avoiding knowing them?
That's a lot of questions. But yes, your question is completely accurate. If you're interested in going really into that, I actually did a talk in Boston, like in 2019. I forget the name of the talk, where I actually analyze. I try to use Heidegger's questions concerning technology, and I try to show how it can help us understand our involvement with technology. And I talk about the traditions of Enoch and the traditions of Cain and the problem with that. And so you have to understand technology as an acceleration of the garments of skin. And so technology always has a dual nature. It always makes you more and makes you less at the same time. And so it's always a kind of protecting you from death by adding a layer of death. So once you understand that, and that all technology, that's what it is, then it can help you pretty much understand everything about technology, and that technology is neither a good nor a bad, and it has the propensity to make you dependent on it. It has a propensity of make you feel self-sufficient. It has negative propensities, but it's also useful. Like, it's actually useful to exist in a world of death and inevitable and part of the fall. Like, God, and then ultimately the way to understand it is that it's a part of the fall which ultimately gets transformed by God into glory. And I don't totally understand how that's going to happen, but that seems to be what is suggested in the tradition of the New Jerusalem, which is that the image of the city of Cain and Babel and Rome is kind of brought together in glory. And so the city is made of gold. It has jewels. It is a glorious image of a city, and it gathers in it all the glory of the nations, which you can understand. Glory is an extension of something. And so technology can also be a kind of glory, like a crown, right, on the head of a king. It's an extension of your being. And so that's the mystery. It's one of the biggest mysteries, I think, in Christianity or in Scripture, is the relationship between death and glory and how one becomes the other. And I think that that's what's being suggested in the image of the New Jerusalem. And so it's hard because people wish I could give them a solution. Like, is technology good? Is it bad? It's just both at the same time, and it has a propensity to go one way or the other. So, yeah.
Good. You had mentioned that icon carving is a secondary art within the Orthodox Church. What's the primary?
It'd be icons, like colored icons, painted icons and mosaics, flat images. Let's say those would be the main art in the Orthodox tradition.
Very good. All right. We have Jan. Hey, Jonathan. Recently, I've become interested in church history. This brought up some serious questions. One of the most prominent questions / struggles I now have is how to make sense of the coexistence of multiple denominations. There should only be one church as far as I could tell. This, in fact, became a very personal existential struggle for me at the moment, as I'm concerned about my relationship to Christ and thus his body. For some context, I grew up in a Baptist church, but never really considered myself a Baptist, having no problem embracing non-Baptist traditions or rejecting Baptist traditions. I'd be very curious about your thoughts on this. And on a side note, I'd also be very curious about your view on the Assyrian Church of the East. God bless.
And so it's kind of, you could say it's like part of the scandal of the story of Christianity. I think it's part of its emptying. And like I said, this emptying that we talked about before, and so you can imagine that Christianity kind of splinters, and then through this splintering fills up the world. And it's actually how it happened. That's how it happened. It's like, all these denominations going all over the place trying to spread Christianity. And I think it's a scandal. I'm not saying it's good, it's bad. But that's the mystery of, one of the mysteries of Christianity, is how we can see that in scandal, God covers the scandal somehow. God makes the scandal participate in the bigger story. And so I nonetheless believe that I could say something like the orthodoxy is the one true church, which is something that a lot of Orthodox will say, and I can say that I have no problem. I do think that, but I also think that the splintering of Christianity is one of the ways in which the seed of Christ is being spread into the outer darkness. Is a good way to understand that. And so I think that that's probably the best way that I can answer that. And so what do I think of the Assyrian Church of the East? I mean, there's definitely some interesting things there, at least historically. For sure a lot of the saints that I love, Saint Ephraim and Saint Isaac of Nineveh, they're amazing. And there are other amazing writings from the Church of the East, and a lot of really powerful tradition seems to have come from there and have been preserved there, including the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, which we talked about with Richard Rowland, including probably people think the works of Pseudo-Dionysius. And so there's a lot there, and that church I think has kept a lot of mysteries alive. Let's say, I don't know today, but at least historically they have. And maybe one last thing is that they also seem to be a good bridge between let's say a bridge to help you see how the Hebrew world or the Jewish world can connect to the Christian world. Because the Assyrian church seems to be more Semitic in its references, in its approach, in its let's say in its cosmology, and so because of that, there are some things, by looking at Syrian writings, you can bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament a little more easily. So like St. Ephraim's hymns on paradise is really a wonderful way to bridge the gaps between the Old and New Testament, and not only a wonderful way, but a way that can really help you make sense of so many things once you start to see the world through the lens of Saint Ephraim's work. It can help you understand a lot of stuff. And you can, if you know me, you'll see that I've got St. Ephraim's program running in the back of my mind. Like, I'm not always referring to him, but it's like it's running there in the back. And every time I talk about, this hierarchy, this mountain, I've got St. Ephraim whispering in my ear. So, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, obviously who's not Assyrian, but those two saints especially are always whispering in my ear when I talk about this kind of this holy mountain, let's say.
One thought I have on the multiplicity of denominations is, like you said, it's not good. God's going to bring it all together. But it does seem like different denominations major in different aspects of God's nature. And so through various perspectives, we're able to have a broader communal understanding of God's nature, which I don't think will be fully reconciled till God gathers it all together. But I think that's a part of the gathering of the nations at the end, is that God, sort of like having children come from Adam, there's this division and growth that requires difference, but that's part of the beauty, even though they're irreconcilable in their current form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to say it, I think.
All right, Julian asks the next question. Jonathan, what's your take on the strange parable of the unjust steward in Luke 16, which is, so the master commanded the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. Probably commended.
Commended the unjust steward, because I don't know, what is this? I would need more context. I don't remember. I'm not a chapters and verse guy. Like when you say chapter this, I don't know. I'm a stories guy. What's the story?
I'm assuming that the story is the one where the steward is told he's going to be kicked out and he has a little bit of time. So he goes ahead and he forgives different debts and he scratches off amounts that people owe his master, so that those people, once he gets kicked out, they give him support and succor. And so then he's commended because he was shrewd in his dealings.
Why is it that I don't know this very well? This parable. I need to read it. My goodness. So he basically. Okay, let's read it. Okay, Luke 16. Let me just read it. There's a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions, so he called him and asked him in. What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you will be welcome into eternal dwellings. Yeah, I remember that parable. That's a weird parable. I definitely would have to think about it more before answering, because that is definitely very strange. One of those things that if no one wants to quote of Christ, because probably no one understands what it's referring to. So let me make a challenge of that. Like, let me try to think about that parable and maybe make a video about it or something. So let's do that.
Oh, that sounds fun. That's better. Yeah. Okay, Charlie Brown. I lost my spot. There we go. Jonathan. Viewing reality through a symbolic lens can lead to very creative ways of explaining reality. Especially for lay people, I would assume there is a real danger in seeing patterns where there aren't any, like watching the clouds and seeing a horse, and someone next to you sees a car and another one sees just a set of aerosol particles at high altitude. It seems evident that even the most atheist, woke postmodern observers recognize symbols and patterns, though they may be more diabolon than symbolon. How does Eastern Orthodoxy, and how should everyone in general, safeguard themselves against possible misinterpretations? And how do we discern different interpretations of patterns that we are being offered?
And so in terms of pattern, it's not that difficult. Like in terms of understanding pattern, you have to test the pattern, right? You have to test the pattern across different levels of reality. And so if you perceive a pattern, then you always have to ask yourself, can other people perceive that pattern? And also, is this pattern congruent with other patterns, other stories, other levels? Does it work at a social level? Does it work at a personal level? Does it work, and so that's how you have to kind of test the patterns. So the example that you give of people looking at the clouds and seeing all these forms, I mean, it's a real experience, but it's also not a very solid experience. It's a fluid experience. And so you can see it because that's actually what happens as you're looking at the cloud changes and then you see something else or you see nothing, and so it's a transitory pattern that has more to do with the transitory nature of reality, because also, like you said, other people don't see the same thing as you see different things. And so understanding how looking at this fluid reality and seeing patterns shift and change and be variable in different perceptions is actually part of the bigger pattern, right? It's part of the bigger pattern. You could say like a hierarchy of patterns, and then some patterns are stable and hold and manifest themselves at different levels, and then some are small and fluid and idiosyncratic. And so that one would be, let's say, looking at clouds and seeing different things has more to do with a kind of idiosyncratic, the idiosyncratic edge of pattern recognition, you could call it. Hope that makes sense.
Charlie, are you there? Did you want to add anything or ask anything? All right. Let's do Micah Mueller. He asked, do Saints Peter and John embody the patterns of Western and Eastern tradition, respectively?
I mean, maybe, I don't know. Some people have seen it that way. But I don't think it's super solid in terms of interpretation. So I would probably mostly say no. I mean, to the extent that let's say to the extent that Saint Peter is related to action and Saint John is related to the more mystical. Like, I think that's why people would say something like that. But yeah, I don't think it holds that well. And there's not a lot of precedent for it. You don't see it so much in kind of traditional imagery. Like, I don't see that as something which has body, let's say.
All right, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation in this next one. He says, Mr. Pageau, have you read the works Joseph de
Maistre? I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't even know how to pronounce his name. I've only seen it written. So Joseph de Maistre. And so what are my thoughts on Joseph de Maistre? Like, I've read really small bits of him, and I know him mostly through René Guénon, who was kind of like a follower of his ideas in terms of at least being counter-revolutionary, let's say. And so I don't know him well enough. You know, I understand that he had some symbolic intuition, but he was also a Freemason, and I think there's probably some ambiguity about him as well. And so yeah, that's gonna be my answer.
I'm going to let one down for a question, which says, what is the symbolism of Freemasonry? And why is it so popular in conspiracy theories?
Well, what's the symbolism of Freemasonry? Like, to me, it's it's a very big question. To me, let's not just Freemasonry. Let's understand it as all the kind of Western esotericism. What I see in Western esotericism and the different branches, whether it's Freemasonry or Rosy Cross, you know, or all these kind of groups, the way that I see it is that there seems to, at some point in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, there seems to have been a split between the explicit kind of religious, liturgical aspect of the church and the mysterious, let's say, spiritual capacity to perceive symbolism and to perceive analogies and to see this kind of cosmic version of Christianity. There seems to have been a split, and then that split manifested itself in these secret societies that had to kind of hide from the church because the church was hostile to what they were saying. And so then what happens, though, is that those secret societies, they end up veering in all kinds of weird directions. And then they also end up being hostile to Christianity ultimately. Not all of them, but many of them end up having a kind of hostility towards the church and turning against them. And I think that that's what the reason why Freemasonry has the reputation that it has and that it's seen the way that it is. I think that the participation of Freemasonry in kind of these conspiracies, I think, is overblown and exaggerated. A lot of the things people say about Freemasonry is a hoax. And it's funny because it's the same hoax that was brought on the Templars when the Templars were arrested, you know, by the French king. And it's the same accusation. And so in the late 19th, I think early 20th century, there was several books were written that took up the very imagery of Baphomet and like the idea that the Masons are Satanists and all this stuff. But it was all a hoax. The guy who promoted it, Leo Taxil, was a hoaxer, and it's been really kind of shown that he was. And so a lot of the things people say about Freemasonry is just not right. It's not true. And it's based on all these weird kind of thinking. But that in Freemasonry, like many things in the 19th and 20th century, was, it seemed, infiltrated by weird occult stuff and kind of weird Egyptology and all kind of magical thinking seems to have infiltrated Freemasonry. And because of all of that, because they were secret, they also seem to have been involved in a lot of revolutionary action. And so there's a relationship between Freemasonry and the American Revolution. There's a relationship between Freemasonry and the French Revolution. And so it's not to say that all Freemasons were part of that, but there is a link that can be found and can be seen. And so in that sense, I think that some of the conspiracies are true in that sense, because it's just, you can see it. And so for that reason, for those reasons, let's say you cannot be a Freemason and a Catholic. You're not supposed to. And you're also not supposed to be a Freemason and Orthodox, although I know that some are. You're not supposed to do that because they see it as a kind of dual allegiance, let's say. And so Freemasonry ends up being a Protestant thing. And it's even more Protestant in the sense that, because it embodies that problem even more, which is a kind of pietism, a kind of moral pietism in the church level, and then a desire to participate in some kind of mystical, esoteric truth on the other. And so it even more radically shows the problem of the modern world and how these things were kind of ripped apart. And so the modern world is that duality. Like, you can see how as the modern world gets more and more materialistic, then this kind of delusion, or this kind of freaking out about these esoteric secret religions, they become stronger, and you hear more about them. Like, a lot of very famous people, like René Descartes, spent half of his life trying to be initiated into the order of the Holy Cross, of the Rosy Cross. Like, this is not just a bunch of nonsense. Like, this is really something that happened in the West. And so anyway, so that's how I see it. So I don't have an open hostility towards Freemasons. I would never become a Freemason. But I don't like, I've had conversations with them, and some of the symbolism they engage with is interesting. But anyways, that can maybe help you understand why they're so prominent in Freemasonry, but in conspiracy theory. But Freemasons are falling apart anyway. It's all falling apart. Like, go to your local chapter and you'll find it like decomposing with a bunch of old men that they can't find anybody to replace them. It's like anything. All of these communities are all falling apart, and Freemasons are no different from others.
All right, Falcon Dark asks, you have described a spirit of the end of the world that is constantly searching out the margin to make it the center. You've also described the spirit as tossing and constantly destroying the margin. Will these two spirits clash, destroy, or subvert it to his own? I don't expect you to have an exact answer. I just want to know what you make of this apparent conflict.
Well, in Revelation, it's presented as the whore and the beast. And so you have these two opposites, one which is an image of tyranny and one which is an image of total depravity and trade and confusion and mixture. And so those two images are related to each other. And so it's like one rides the other, you could say. And you can see this in Rome in the late moment of Rome. And you can see it even in the 20th century, where you can see as the rise of totalitarian systems is strangely preceded by or accompanied with a kind of degeneracy and moral falling apart and confusion of identities, and all this is kind of going on together. And so, but in Scripture and in Revelation, it says that at some point the beast kills the whore, and that seems, at least in my opinion, seems to be what happened in Germany, for example. And so from Weimar Germany to the Reich is the moment when the beast killed the whore. It seems like that is what is on our horizon, like right now, with like all the authoritarian measures which are being set up with COVID and are being prepared with COVID. It seems like we're on the verge of massive clampdown of the beast, you could say. But what's weird about this moment or this time is that there really seems to be a desire to have both, to have the whore and the beast, and just kind of keep them going. at the same time.
Mhm.
And so it's a fascinating moment to see how those two things seem to want to really kind of feed off each other and coexist. I mean, I'm definitely very attentive to see how it's going to play out, but it's hard to know which way is it going to flip. Like, how is it going to flip?
Mhm.
So yeah.
Well, that was a good question. Thank you, Falcon. All right, feature bug. Hello, sir. Your explorations and explanations of symbolic thinking have opened up a whole new world for me. I believe that pattern recognition is a strength, but modern education has to a large extent killed that ability of mine by telling me to shelf almost any pattern I see into one of various categories of coincidence or cognitive bias. But studying your work see slowly that innate perceptual ability in me. My question is, given the fractal nature of true symbols, which you have shown to be present at various levels, starting from the individual, family, society, and so on, can we go down toward the physical and the material and understand the fundamental physical interactions also in a symbolic way? Because right now it appears that at the level of physics, molecular, atomic, etc., things are random. Would you recommend putting efforts in that direction to understand how they're not random but symbolic? Similarly, with the theory of evolution also, I see more and more theists also accepting evolution to be true and trying to fit it into their worldview. And the more we look through an evolutionary lens, we see things as accidental outcomes as opposed to reflecting a deliberate will/plan/design of God. So is it necessary to understand evolution also symbolically at the layer of biology, so that at all levels the patterns which we use are congruent with the spiritual truths of the Bible? Thanks as always for your wonderful work.
All right. So the reason what's making you struggle is that the symbolic pattern happens as a movement across layers of reality. And so if you look at only one layer of reality as being self-sufficient, then that's when you can't see the pattern. The pattern is above the multiplicity. That's what a pattern is. Right? The pattern is above. And so if you go down into the physical, into the constituents of physicality, it's not a surprise that you're going to end up on random stuff, that you're going to end up on potential, like the way Aristotle talked about potential. You're going to end up in the tohu bohu of creation that is described in the beginning of Genesis. And so the meaning and the pattern is higher up. It comes from above. It's not there in the waters. It comes from above. And so the higher up you go on the ontological level of reality, the more the pattern becomes visible, right? And the less random it appears. And so you're right. At the very bottom of reality, maybe that's just raw potentiality. But then as you scale up already, you have identities like particles, and those particles are still are fluctuating. And then as you go higher, you have higher identities that are more stable. And as you keep going up, then you end up having more and more stable higher identities until you reach universal patterns that apply to all of reality, let's say. And so that's really the way to understand it. And it's the same with natural selection, let's say. And so the idea that natural selection and that process of the transformation, biological transformation, the idea that it's random is just because it's random at the level that it's random. And it's not at the level that it's meaningful. Right? So at the level that it's meaningful, it's meaningful. And so I talked about this yesterday in the Q&A. It's like evolutionary biologists will say stupid things like eyes are not for seeing. Right? Eyes are just a random process of millions and millions of years of selection and random mutation, and eyes are not for seeing. Now, that's total bullshit. Eyes are for seeing. They're for seeing at the level they're for seeing. And there are that other stuff if you want at the lower levels, whatever, I don't care. But they're for seeing. It's like meaning comes from above. And you just have to at some point accept that, and then what people will do is say it's an illusion. It's like It's like the meaning is an illusion. I heard what's his name, Krauss, talking to Jordan Peterson. Was it Peter Krauss or whatever his name is? I forget. Talking to Jordan Peterson, saying that basically said all of your experience is an illusion. It's like, okay, dude, that's very nice. Like, how useful is that really? And it's like, your description of it being an illusion is also an illusion. Is that what I'm to understand? Because you end up in a self-referential loop pretty fast when you start saying that kind of nonsense. And so anyways, so sorry to rant about this, but it's like the meaning is the meaning comes, like, I'll say it again. The meaning comes from above. And not only does it come from above, it's necessary and it's inevitable for any form of unity or identity to appear to us. And so that's the best way to understand it. But you can always see it from below and understand that it's these, as you see it from below, that it always looks chaotic. It only looks ordered when you see it as connected to something above. There you go. That's my answer.
Perfect. It was very clear. All right. Gomer Day asks, hello, Mr. Pageau. Question for you. What is the symbolism of tattoo? If there is, then in your opinion, why people are getting them if so obsessed with getting them? And is getting tattoos sinning against God? Thank you for your time and attention.
I mean, I think that there are different forms of, let's say, what the symbolism of tattooing is. I mean, it's really about putting a mark in your flesh, let's say. And so ultimately it's anciently, that the ancient practice of tattoos would have been something like showing your identity with other things, right? It would have been something like participating in the identity of things. And so it could manifest some kind of rank you have in society. It could manifest your participation in a tribe, your participation in a group. And that's what circumcision is as well, right? Circumcision is a mark in your flesh that shows your allegiance to a body, shows your allegiance to God. Okay. And so that is one aspect of the symbolism of the tattoo. Now, the modern aspect of the symbolism of the tattoo is in a way the opposite of that. It has to do with idiosyncrasy and has to do with self-creation. It has to do with the whole thing we talked about with the Wachowski brothers, which is the idea of self-naming, self-identifying, of like ornamenting yourself to your own whims, let's say. And so in that sense, I would say that it's a dangerous game to play because, it's almost like wearing stylized clothing, but on your flesh, directly on your flesh. And so there's a danger of identifying. And so I think that that's why people get obsessed with them, is that they somehow see this as a part of the development of their own being, as this self-marking, as a way to express yourself to the world in a manner which is permanent, and it is also related to sacrifice. Just like circumcision, because it's painful. Getting a tattoo is painful. Everybody knows that it's painful, and so you sacrifice yourself in order to express yourself to the world. And so it's like, I think that's why it also creates obsession, because it's related to a kind of initiation, right? Where you know that you went in and you went under the needle, so you suffered for your self-expression, like a rock star who suffers for his music and that kind of stuff, so is it a sin against God? Like, man, I don't like that kind of stuff. It's not, I think it's a dangerous road to play. I think that if you have tattoos, then don't freak out about it. I think it's still possible for some people. For example, cops will tattoo a cross on their hand, and then it still is the more ancient version of putting a cross on your hand to remind yourself and remind others that you're a Christian, so that in a moment of temptation, you might not convert to Islam, or you might not be taken by Muslims, if you have that mark on your body. So there, in that sense, it becomes closer to something like circumcision.
Good. Thank you. All right. Brian Jacobson asks, hey, JP, if the base symbol is something along the lines of structure at the center with chaos at the margins, What do we make of symbolism where chaos is at the center and structure is at the margins? Physical examples are monitor screens, swimming pools, framed paintings, windows, etc. Is it positively correlated with regeneration and negatively with inversion? I can't help but feel that there is a connection between our current period of inversion and the mass proliferation of media via smartphones.
I don't know if the way that you frame it is completely the right way to understand it, let's say. So there's something about, let's say, let's just take one of the examples you talk about, like, for example, the swimming pool. And so there's a way in which the nature of water is to fall down. And so wherever it rests is always the lowest point. And so resting water is always an image of the margin. It's because it's below whatever is holding it. Like it's falling. And so if you dig a hole in the ground and you make a pool, like, it's below the earth. It's below the surface of the world. So it's participate in this lower reality. And so in that sense, it's different. Like, in terms of a window, the window is on the edge of the house. It's an opening to the outside. So it's like, I think I think you've taken different images and you've kind of brought them together in a way that isn't necessarily the right way to see it. And so it's the same with, like, if you talk about a monitor, then in terms of the monitor, you have the same reality, which is that a monitor, the meaning is in the middle and the materiality is on the outside. And so again, you have the same thing where although you can say that it's chaos, but it's meaning, even if some of the meaning isn't necessarily, the right meaning, it's still meaning, and language is coming from the center of the monitor. And then on the outside, you have the periphery, let's say. And so anyway, so I think it's maybe because just the way that you're kind of interpreting things is not there. You're not bringing them together in a way that totally makes sense, let's say. But you can contain chaos. Like, the idea of containing chaos, maybe this can help you. Like, the idea of containing chaos is very useful. That's what drinking water is, right? Drinking water is contained chaos. It's the sweet waters. And so it's not the bitter waters that you see in scripture, the salty waters or the bitter waters that you can't consume, but it's like fresh water from above, which is contained. And because it's contained, then it's something which can refresh you, and it's become useful for you, right? It's useful chaos. And so that's what constrained chaos is. So it's the difference between let's say, in terms of masculine and feminine, the difference between the wife of your youth and the strange woman that Solomon talks about, the well and the waters of the ocean and the chaotic waters on the side of the world. And so that's the way to understand it. Always remember that chaos and potential are just two words for the same thing. And so, and so we always have to be careful because there is this tendency to think of potentiality and to think of chaos as just negative, but chaos is the potential for the world. And so it's not just a negative thing.
Did you want to respond to that, Brian?
No, that makes sense. I think I get sometimes hung up on structure and rigidity, and that's where my thinking was placed, but I appreciate your clarification, Jonathan.
All right, Chad the alcoholic. Greetings. Would you consider the online storytelling and discussion work you do a form of auditory icon creation? And how has it affected your faith?
No, I don't think so. It's like, no, I wouldn't consider a form of auditory icon creation. Most of the stuff I'm doing is interpretation, and it's secondary. It's very secondary. And it's part of its secondary nature has to do that in the fact that it's on YouTube. Like, what I'm doing is fine, but I've said it several times that the reason that the fact that I need to interpret symbols is a bad sign for where we are in the pattern, right? It means that we're actually we're not easily in the mode of participation. ancient people and to a certain extent simple people, like, you know, the poor, the folk, they intuitively get it. They don't even, the explanations might even seem alien to them. The explaining of symbolism is something that is good for kind of intellectual Westerners that feel alienated and need a way back into participation. So it's very different. So the way of understanding something like a verbal icon would mostly be something like a hymn, be something like a singing praise of God. That would be something like a verbal icon, and the liturgy itself, let's say.
And how has it affected your faith?
What, talking about this stuff? It's actually, I think, like, I mean, I don't know. It's a dual thing. It's like, on the one hand, it's dangerous because it makes me prideful, and it's like something that I have to be very careful of, because it's hard. It's definitely hard to stay humble when you have attention. Like, that's very difficult. And so for sure, I felt that pull, and moments where, like, when I review the certain moments, like that I am arrogant, or that I'm owed certain things. So I have to be really cautious of that. But then on the other hand, it's been positive in the sense that it's also forced me, let's say, to take seriously, because it's like, as I'm saying something, like, I have this feeling like, are you a hypocrite, Jonathan? Like, how much of this you're saying that you're actually embodying? Like, how much of this that you're saying that you're actually living? And so it's also been like a way for me to kind of push myself into constraining my thoughts, and getting a hold over my bad habits, and being more involved in my own prayer life, and stuff like that. So it's been dual, and so hopefully you can all pray for me that it goes rather in the right direction. Let's say that would be much better.
I will keep praying for your soul.
Well,
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Swag like Caillou Bazani asks, in Christian scholarship today, including Eastern Orthodox, there is much being said about ancient Near East / Second Temple view of the world, and how that can shape our interpretation of Scripture. Why should we look to the Middle Ages as the high water mark and telos to return to, and not the ANE / Second Temple period?
I mean, you mean despite the fact that the temple was destroyed after Christ? You mean despite that? I mean, the temple was destroyed. Like, I'm sorry to say, not only was it destroyed, but it seems like that's what Christ was talking about often. Like, that he was saying, guys, get ready, because this is ending. Like, this world of yours is ending. People don't realize to what extent, when Christ said the world is ending, the world ended. The world ended after Christ. A generation, not a generation after Christ, the world ended, let's say. And so I don't think that the Second Temple is the right place to put ourselves in. I think, like, in terms of Christians, I think that the Middle Ages offer us, let's say, a moment, or even not just the Middle Ages, but like early Christianity and the Middle Ages, they offer us a line to follow to move back towards Christ, and a line which becomes more and more diluted. But I agree with you. Like, I think that there's something about the last moments, like there's something about the end, which is very interesting, which is that I really do think that there's something providential about the 19th century and the early 20th century rediscoveries of all these old texts. I think there's something providential about that, in terms of the Book of Enoch, and in terms of the Second Temple texts, the Qumran, and all of these types of things. I think it is used very subversively by a lot of scholars, but I think that in that kind of subversive use, you find people like Father Stephen DeYoung, who is rather able to kind of use it as a way to reinvigorate some of the liturgical forms that we have, and that maybe we don't understand anymore, that have become more like that have a little more, that have become almost, that have been emptying themselves a little bit. And so I nonetheless, that's why I point you guys to Lord of Spirits, is because I do believe that re-understanding Second Temple Judaism and the tradition of the Book of Enoch, especially, is a good thing for us to understand as well. And it's helpful. It's been helpful, but we need to do it in a way that's not subversive and not there to say. Because one of the things you've all seen it, all the scholars that are just constantly trying to tell us of how all the other Christians before you were just a bunch of idiots, and that none of them understood anything except for me and my reading of these Second Temple texts. And it's like, that is just it's just unbearable to watch people do that. And people that I love and respect, I've seen moving in that direction, sadly. So we need to rather see it as a continuity, and these rediscoveries of these treasures as a way in which we can now cover our Father, as we can walk backwards and cover our Father, and then go into the underworld and get our dead Father and reinvigorate that. And so I think I see it rather as a way to do that, and I definitely prefer that than the all those stupid ancient people now we know attitude.
Perfect. All right, Andrew with the bangs asks, why is prophecy associated with the feminine? Thank you so much for your time.
I know, is prophecy associated with the feminine? Or sometimes it is. Like, I don't know, like is it associated with the feminine in scripture? Really? I don't know. I think that if you...
Can I clarify?
Go, Andrea, there you are. What are you saying, Andrea?
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, I saw somebody post on either the Lord of Spirits Facebook group or the Symbolic World. I can't remember which one. They kind of blend together. But so someone said, asked the question: is kingship the amalgamation of masculine and feminine, with priest being on the masculine side, prophecy or prophet being on the other side, and then the masculine and feminine together in king and queen? And so that just made me wonder, I didn't know prophecy was feminine. So I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, I don't think that's the sorry, Andrew. I don't think that's the proper way of seeing it. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so let me tell you, to the extent that the prophecy is feminine, maybe we can talk about it this way. The prophecy is feminine in the sense, to the extent that the prophet is a vehicle for the word of God. And so in that way, the prophet has a feminine role, in the sense that the prophet receives the light or receives the seed from above and then gives that to the world, right? Reveals it to the world. So in that sense, that's how you can understand the let's say the prophet as feminine. But I don't think that separating priests and prophets between masculine and feminine, I don't think that's the right way to do it. There are other opposites besides masculine and feminine.
Why? I liked that. Why did you?
Really? Did you? Let me give you. Let me get the prophet. The prophet is something like pure spiritual interaction without mediation, that then needs to be mediated by an official structure. Mm-hmm. And so the prophet receives directly from God, let's say, the insight, and then is somewhat, because of that, is a little bit on the side of, how can I say this? It's dangerous to a certain extent, because sometimes the prophets don't have that frame, and so they can tend to be like fire coming down from heaven, right, to consume, just like Elijah, who brings down the fire from heaven. And so that's something that the prophets have, and their role is often to rebuke the authority structures. In that sense, it's like they have this direct access, but you have to be careful, because without the frame of the temple, and without the frame of the law, then they just can be like a kind of wild wind that doesn't have a body, and can become heretical, let's say. So that's kind of the way I think that's probably the best way to kind of understand the relationship between. So it's very similar to like saints and priests, the prophet in the Old Testament, and the the priestly caste and the prophets are equivalent, you could say, to something like priests and saints in the New Testament.
Okay, can I just say why it made sense to me really quickly? I'm sorry, I'm
Go
taking up
for
your
it,
time.
Andrea.
So, okay, because I just remember it in Paul's writings, he says that women are allowed to prophesy in front of the congregation, or not congregation, but in front of the group, but not teach. So that's why, and I please correct me if I'm wrong, folks. I might be wrong, but I thought that's why that made sense to me. Oh, that's why women were allowed to prophesy, because it was a feminine space.
Well, you're probably onto something, right? In the sense that in the role of the prophet, the prophet receives the word of God and doesn't have authority, in a way, doesn't have power like to enact anything. Like the prophet doesn't have power to impose a rule or to impose a law or to do things. The prophet receives from God and then manifests that to the world. And so in a way is a pure spiritual relationship, let's say. And so maybe you can understand it that way, which is that in receiving the word of God and manifesting it to the church, the woman who was receiving the prophecy wasn't acting as an authority figure. She wasn't acting as a priest. She was acting as this vehicle for the grace of God, let's say.
Okay,
I'll
accept
so I think
that.
that's probably the best way to understand it, at least in my.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's funny because when I heard that, I would have thought it would be opposite. I would have thought of the priest as being feminine and the prophets as more masculine, because the priests offer up from below,
and the priests also have a feminine aspect too. The priests also have a feminine aspect too, because they also, especially the priest in the old sense, let's say, like you said, they receive from God and then give to the people. So it's like, that's why that opposition is probably not the best way to understand that relationship.
Good. Thank you. All right. Samuel says, have you considered that you and Richard Rollin are embodying the spirit of the 1981 film Time Bandits with your Universal History series?
That's hilarious. No, I haven't thought about that, but that's awesome. I'm for that. No problem. I'll take that. I'm having a blast. Like you can probably tell that I really love talking to Richard, and we really have fun in our discussion. So,
and we are loving it. So keep them going. All right. Pecan Nooch says, Dear Mr. Pageau, in your analysis of Marvel's WandaVision, you say the show is telling an unholy between Wanda, a satanic joker who wants the crown for herself, and Vision, a perfect AI that is worth torturing others to preserve. I hadn't seen the show before I saw your analysis, so I took your word for granted. Now that I've seen it, I'm a bit confused and have a lot of questions, but we'll keep it short. When talking about evil witch rituals, you showed footage of a moment when supposedly good witches are trying to get a supposedly evil witch. Were you certain that this analysis was entirely accurate? Vision is, after all, not only made up of several AI circuits, but also the Mind Stone, a magical mythological object in the Marvel storytelling. You could compare him to Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, a socially awkward nerd who primarily interprets himself and acts as biological/chemical machine burdened with consciousness. In any case, what really matters is the journey that flawed characters go through, and the Vision in the show ends up accepting his death for the sake of rescuing the townspeople. He also holds hope that he might have a life after death, after accepting that his identity is founded on the love of people close to him. Wouldn't you agree that such a story is Christian rather than satanic? And while Wanda is the Scarlet Witch, she only realizes this over the course of the show, as she has to fight to keep her powers out of the hands of someone who is actually evil, who purposefully trapped Wanda's children instead of Wanda's subconscious trapping of the townspeople. Just like Vision, Wanda learns to let go of unrealistic life that is no longer possible. Wouldn't you agree that framing Wanda's arc as satanic is perhaps too cynical a conclusion? Thank you for reading my question.
I mean, I don't know what to say. There'd be a lot to say. It's like, I'm not sure. We'll see. I'm not, for the things that you say, it's like, I'm not sure that that's what's happened. For example, when you say that she learns to let go of an unrealistic life that is no longer possible, I mean, that's not how the show ends. And when the show ends, you see her in this like mystical state of witch studying, and she hears the voice of her children. And so it's like, not sure that that's what's going on in the story. And her children are just imaginations. Like they're just they're her own creation of her own mind. That's what her children are. They're not real beings. I mean, maybe they are in the like weird Marvel vision of things. And the same with the idea of Vision. And so Vision is more like a golem, right? He's more like a ghost in the shell situation where it's an improper union of mind and body, you could say. And so I know that that's not how they play it out. Like, I know that that's not how they want you to see him, but that's also not how they want you. That's not how they're going to want you to see AI either. Right? If I say something like AI is the unnatural union of intelligence and technology, then I'll get as much pushback from futurists as what you're saying. And so I understand that in the show they want to represent Vision as a virtuous, like this kind of virtuous character. But to me, the fact that they take this human created machine that is filled, that has a mind stone and is magically made alive as a superhero, and they want to make him into a virtuous character instead of making into the golem that he is, or the Frankenstein monster that has been the precedent for these types of beings. To me, that's the problem. That's the problem in the first place. And so it's like, I don't negate the fact that in the story they tried to show these types of arcs, and that this artificial being is sacrificing himself. Like, I see that that's what they're doing. I just think that all in all, it's a very problematic way of representing reality. And so I don't know. I mean, and like I said, I also don't think that the entire show is just a complete scandal. Like you said, I mean, they tried to have character arcs in the story, but it all ends up being very, very, very odd. I don't know. It's just very odd to me. And it's very odd that even though Wanda does torture people, like torture these people, that she is nonetheless represented as the hero and the victim, as a victim in the story too. As a kind of victim of this government that wants to stop her from torturing all these people in the town. And that weird statement which is that this weird statement about how when the lady says they won't know what you sacrificed, and it's like, what did she sacrificed? She sacrificed her imaginary children and her artificially resurrected husband that she kept in a kind of completely unnatural state. That's what she sacrificed for the entire town being tortured by her for who knows how long that story lasted. And so I don't know. I just can't go with you on the way you're interpreting it. So anyway, sorry.
Thank you very much for your response. Could I briefly respond to you?
Sure.
I would first of all agree that there's definitely space for your interpretation of Vision as a golem, and it's definitely a weird show. I think the themes are immaturely worked out compared to a more biblical story. But I do think in the ending, it ends on Wanda walking away from the house where the entire simulation started. So that for me signals her, leaving that life behind. Even though, she's still magical, but she leaves behind the fantasy.
Yeah, she should have faced her crimes for freaking torturing people. Or like, however, she should go to jail is where she should go. Like, she shouldn't go into a cabin to find a way to get her imaginary children back, which seems to be what she's doing. But I know it's hard to know because it does end in a kind of cliffhanger. So it's hard to know if that's what she's doing, but it seems like that's what she's doing. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry. I kind of get what you're saying, but I think like when you kind of pull back and look at it, you're like, man, like that's freaky. It's like, it's freaky. It's freaky that she's not held accountable for her crimes. And that she's seen as a kind of she just walks away from this thing that she created, and the government that tried to stop her is seen as this evil, tyrannical thing that tried to stop what is completely insane in terms of a phenomena. So, anyways, that's yeah. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I'm not saying it's completely unredeemable. Like, there's nothing good about this show in terms of but I think that when you kind of pull back, it just appears very, very odd.
Well, now I actually want to watch it.
Yeah.
All right.
I think if it's okay, I think I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to go because I'm kind of coming to the end of my capacities here, if that's okay with everybody. No. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to butcher your name. Sorry. Ryan Fida Glean. I heard someone say that Orthodoxy thinks of God so merciful or loving that he is unjust. Any thoughts on God in terms of justice and love from an Orthodox perspective? Also, what's the most positive thing you can say about penal substitutionary atonement? Love to have you here. You're great.
I don't know. I've never heard that, saying that God is so merciful or loving that he is unjust. I think the best way to understand the rigor of God in terms of Christianity is to understand the rigor of God as a form of medicine, you could say, in order to bring closer to God through mercy and rigor. And so it's like sometimes you apply mercy, something like with a child. It's like sometimes you're severe with the child, and then sometimes you are you let things go. But you have to kind of balance that out so that the child doesn't become spoiled, and also so that the child doesn't just act out of fear and being terrified of you. So I think that it's the same with God, where the two hands of God are kind of acting acting together in order to ultimately save us. And so there's also an aspect that's in kind of this Orthodox eschatology where, it says, for example, St. Ephraim the Syrian, or I think it's St. Isaac. I think it's St. Isaac who said, the fire that burns in hell is the love of God. And so there's also a way in which the love of God transcends the duality of just mercy and rigor, and appears to us as mercy or rigor, depending on our own state of being, let's say. This whole idea of shoveling coals on someone's head, it's like the shoveling of the coals, it's love burning you. And so it seems like that's also part of it, where it's like, depending on the way in which you are disposed towards God, that love will manifest itself to you as mercy or rigor. And so, yeah, so that's the best way I have to interpret that. And what do I think about a penal substitutionary atonement? I'm not a big fan of it. I think, most Orthodox are not a big fan of that kind of interpretation. So I don't think I've ever even talked about it. If you watch my entire, library video since 2017, I tend to not talk about it.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. We've really appreciated having you here.
Thanks for the wonderful questions. I feel like I just love it when I enter into a situation where I'm saying things I've never said before, and kind of people are kind of pushing me to say things I've never said before. And I feel like that happened several times in this conversation. So I really appreciate everybody's effort to give good questions. And I really wish the best to all the Bridges of Meaning people. And and we're looking forward to seeing what comes about in the future with this strange internet space and how it can kind of feed into other things. So thanks for the invitation.